we talk about media for coping, we're really talking about using technology to sort of address these emotional needs we have, right? So it's not so much that like one technology is better than another or more adaptive, or one content is better than another or more. It's sort of how people are selecting to use it and work it into their own needs and motivations, right?
Hello world, you're listening to SPARTIE-Cast.
Hello and welcome back to SPARTIE-Cast. I am your host, Dr. Robby Ratan. This is the Social and Psychological Approaches to Research on Technology Interaction Effects Lab podcast, SPARTIE-Cast. I am thrilled to host our guest, Allison Eden. She's a colleague of mine here in the College of Communication, Arts and Sciences. She's an associate professor in their Department of Communication, in our Department of Communication. I'm in the Department of Media and Information, so we kind of sit at different ends of the hallways. There's no strong rivalry, though we do sometimes have some social comparison, you know, who's publishing more, getting more grants. But fundamentally, Allison and I come from the same ilk, communication PhD, studying media technology. She studies media effects in the entertainment realm, which is a bit afar from my kind of serious games, VR, avatars focus. I focus on games more as a means to an end, whereas she focuses on games and media generally, social media, television, etc., kind of as something that people do as leisure activities to cope with stress or to figure out the meaning of life, as she'll talk about in this episode. So I hope you enjoy it. Hello, Dr. Eden, Allison Eden, friend and colleague for many years now. Welcome to SPARTIE-Cast. Hey,
thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So I'm so stoked to have you because we're shifting gears a little bit. I often talk about virtual reality and the metaverse, but I actually want to come back to that once we get into your research about coping with the pandemic through media use.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds great.
Yeah. But can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to this topic?
Yeah, sure. So I think I have kind of an unusual background for someone who studies media. Growing up, I had very restricted media use. My mom thought it was, going to ruin my ability to read and think critically. And it was always a little bit of the forbidden fruit, like, ooh, what is on the television that's so enticing and exciting. So yeah, that's eventually many years later translated into a degree in communication, specializing in media psychology. So I study how people use media functionally in their day-to-day life and, don't become mind-controlled zombies, and how for most of us, we're pretty able to incorporate a good amount of screen time in our day-to-day life with sometimes mostly no negative effects and a lot of times some positive effects. So this is media use for coping is sort of, and well-being is sort of well within my wheelhouse of interests.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. I know I recently read a statistic that parents see video games as a benefit for helping kids transition to online education. And I found that to be a little bit surprising, but also a good news story. Media aren't all bad, though the media might present them in negative, moral, panicky ways.
Yeah, I think we're fighting a lot of moral panics. I mean, thanks, Mom. I do love reading. I read all the time. But I think you could also, spend some time with screens and it's probably going to be okay.
Absolutely. And reading can be a little bit displacing of healthier activities. My kids, they're just as stuck to the books for hours at a time as they are to the video games. Like, go out, play, talk to your friends. They're reading the books. I mean, to me, I don't see a huge difference, at least in that displacement.
No, not really. Not really.
So you've got this background looking at the positive sides, or at least the not negative sides of media use. And then the pandemic happened. And I think you, like I, thought, wow, if everyone's connecting over media, we should be studying this at this moment.
Yeah, well, I was really interested particularly, in our students who were really abruptly transitioned from being face to face and in a really hyper social environment. I mean, college is an incredibly social sort of time in our lives, and suddenly everybody was displaced, physically displaced, but then also sort of mentally displaced too, and disconnected. And so I and some colleagues so Benjamin Johnson from University of Florida, and Sarah Grady here at Michigan State, and another colleague of ours in Germany, started thinking, gosh, what is this doing to our students, and how are they going to cope with this sudden change in all of our circumstances, not to mention sort of the stress and anxiety of living through a pandemic, right? I mean,
Oh yeah, there's
a
that.
lot. Yeah, I mean, so there was a lot to take on there.
And Ben was a grad from our program as well, right? From our college.
Yeah, he was. So he got his master's at Michigan State,
Mhm.
and then his PhD was from Ohio State.
Okay.
Sorry, the Ohio State University.
The Ohio State.
Excuse
So
me.
a
Yeah.
team of a team of scholars interested in this topic. And so how did you approach it?
So those of us who were involved in the project were really interested, particularly in how sort of these different experiences of stress, so not having the resources to cope with sort of what life is demanding of you, but also anxiety, so sort of the feeling of being confronted with something that's completely, you can't manage it. There's not a lot of personal activities you can do to manage living through a pandemic, right? It's sort of like the Titanic hitting the iceberg. Like, you can't avoid it, right? And so we thought, gosh, how is that translating into media use? And we turned to media. We thought about media use really for practical reasons. One, because we're all media scholars, but also because you have all these students who are suddenly at home connecting over the internet for classes, but they were also, meeting their social needs via the internet. They're also meeting their all of the recreational needs that we were meeting via, sports clubs or leisure activities or dining activities. All of a sudden, they're all now regulated to be at the home. So one way that people could fill sort of that giant void was by turning to media. So that was sort of our main thrust, was first just looking to see what people were doing, right? And then follow-up studies, we've developed a lot of questions to kind of ask, how are they doing it and what are they feeling about it? So we've got, survey data, so numbers, and we've also got a lot of diary data where people wrote about sort of what they were selecting and why in a very sort of like self-reflective way.
So what did you find? What were people doing?
Well, unsurprisingly, we did two things. We had a study right as soon as everybody went online. So we had a one study that was from March 14th, 2020 to about April 17th, 2020. So that first kind of month that everybody went online, and we found, unsurprisingly, that people were stressed and anxious. They didn't feel good. So what we found was that people were using a lot more media to find out information about the pandemic. So a lot of people were turning to the news to find out what was going on, to get updates about things. But then we also found that people were turning to the media to connect with other people, or to connect with people that they found themselves quarantined with. So we had a lot of people who said, this has been nice because I've been able to spend time with my family watching old movies, or my roommate and I had a list of movies we wanted to watch together, and this has given us the opportunity to do it. So there was a lot of sort of time management, so emotion management, but also time management. We also saw people turning to sort of newer media. So TikTok, we saw a lot of people using TikTok for hedonic sort of mood regulation because it's comedic, it's diverting, it's pleasurable. Mm-hmm. And I think what was perhaps most interesting is we also saw people regulating their media use to not feel bad. So people who couldn't hang out with their friends stopped using social media like Instagram and Facebook as much. They said, I just don't want to see what other people are doing without me. I want to focus on myself. So it's very sort of self-protective. And these different sort of media use strategies led to different types of well-being. So we saw people regulating their mood, by watching more comedies. We saw people, and that led to, sort of better affective mood outcomes, right? We saw people who were sort of successful in reframing the pandemic instead of saying like, oh gosh, this is a really insurmountable problem. We're never going to move past this as a society. I'm really worried about it. We saw people reframing it. So a lot of people kind of turned away from news and turned towards other types of reframing for the pandemic, like Contagion. The movie Contagion was incredibly popular during this time period, right? To kind of reframe it as like a narrative where we could come out on the other end, right? And we saw that that had, again, these sort of positive impacts on people's perspective, well-being, and ability to manage themselves.
Interesting. So you mentioned hedonic, which is, joyful, happy media use. And then regulation, emotion regulation, coping. Is that, would you describe that as a eudaimonic experience, which is kind of a fulfilling media experience, or is it different?
So it's slightly different. Eudaimonic media experiences is more about like the meaning of life and like finding really meaningful things, right? And we actually found really sort of different. So people that were experiencing more stress tended to lean more towards hedonic management. So they looked more to like comedies or TikToks or pleasurable sort of like mood kind of like affecting things.
Makes
and
sense.
Then people, it does. That makes sense. When I'm stressed, I turn to things that make me laugh.
Sure.
And people that were more anxious actually were more likely to turn to eudaimonic or these sort of meaning in life type of media contents. And we actually saw that that was a better strategy overall for improving well-being outcomes.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it was linked to just, increases in, we used a human flourishing scale to measure well-being. We used a couple different mood outcomes, depression outcomes, these kinds of like self-report outcomes. So this is all self-report data, but still it was really interesting to see that people that kind of tried to take a broader perspective and look at the meaning in life type of contents rather than just the plain hedonic, that tended to lead to slightly better outcomes mentally.
Oh, interesting. And so you're looking at mostly passive media, not necessarily interactive, like games or virtual worlds, right?
So it's interesting that you asked that. I actually kind of thought, because I like playing games and I like VR as well. So I thought that maybe we would see people using more games. And we did see some people turning towards games, but it tended to be more of a nostalgic exercise. So people would, like Animal Crossing was really big during the pandemic, right? So we saw people turning to these kind of like games, or Pokemon. They turned to these games from their childhood a little bit more. But overall, we didn't get a lot of reports of people using a lot of games or using a lot of virtual reality, which I thought was kind of interesting. Yeah, it was mostly sort of streaming media. It was mostly television. It was mostly social media. That could have been the way we asked the questions, though, so I don't want to say like it wasn't happening. It's just we didn't get a lot of sort of self-report of these things.
Who are the participants again? Students mostly, or?
Yep, students from Michigan State and from University of Florida. What's kind of interesting is that we did see, so we collected data twice. We had that spring data, which was the data I was just talking to you about. But then we also collected data in the fall. So kind of over the November period from the same group. So not the same people necessarily, but still the same students from the same universities. And we found that, overall stress and anxiety decreased. So people were feeling a bit better in the fall than they were immediately in the spring. So that was good. But we did also see a lot more sort of awareness of time management in the fall. So in the spring, it was a lot of filling time. And in the fall, it was a lot of, oh gosh, now I have to get back to work. Now I have to get back to school. I've got to get off of these apps.
Okay, interesting. So people were worried about their media use.
Yeah, they were more worried about the time spent with media in the fall, for sure.
Because they were going back to their regularly scheduled programming. Still, some of the media use was interactive, like Facebook, TikTok, Twitter. What were some of the differences? Did you ask about differences in the media platforms? And do you remember if there's anything that might like relate to the interactivity or the sense of presence in these different platforms?
So yeah, that's a really interesting question. So we looked at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and YouTube for sort of the more interactive media platforms. And this is, again, it was all from sort of self-report. It was what people were saying that they themselves were using, and what we saw was that there was a lot more. We asked two different kinds of questions. We said, what are you using more, and what are you trying to avoid? Okay, so it was like two separate questions. And what we saw was that early on in the pandemic, people were they basically used everything more, but they used TikTok a lot more, they used Twitter a lot more, they used Instagram a lot more than they had, in the weeks prior to that. to going home, right? To social distancing.
Hmm.
But then in the fall study, we see that people were avoiding Instagram, avoiding Twitter, avoiding Facebook. So sort of as the pandemic progressed, people really started avoiding a lot of these social media platforms, and most of them said it was because of fear of missing out or being concerned about what people were posting on these sites, or being unhappy. So they said things like, I'm stuck at home and I'm seeing my friends out partying, and I don't approve of that behavior. I don't like it. It makes me feel bad. So I'm avoiding these sites that show them doing that. But TikTok use stayed pretty high. People weren't avoiding TikTok. They were just avoiding these other social media platforms that they had turned to more earlier on in the pandemic.
Interesting. I wonder if a bit of that had to do with the political climate of the fall 2020 as well, right? Like,
Yeah, I think so. I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think people were nervous about the election and about what, their friends and colleagues were saying about things. So we did see like a media avoidance coming up really strongly in the fall, but it was over that sort of US election period.
we did surveys on similar topics looking more at loneliness,
Hmm.
and we found, this isn't published yet. I hope it gets published eventually. But we found that of those platforms, you didn't mention Snapchat, but we
Oh
found,
yeah, at Snapchat, let me take a look at Snapchat. Snapchat looked, I think, similar to Snapchat and Facebook looked really similar,
oh,
which I
interesting.
found, yeah, I found that interesting as well.
And
So
that's,
Instagram and Twitter, we saw like a lot more use early in the pandemic. Like people were seeking it out, and then by November, people were really trying to avoid both of those platforms.
mhm.
Whereas both Facebook and Snapchat were kind of like equally sought out and avoided early on in the pandemic, and then avoided later on.
We had a different metric, just looking at amount of use and self-reported loneliness, and we found Snapchat to be associated with the least loneliness.
Hmm.
And we hypothesize that's because it's more of a personal interaction, right? You snap
Right.
chat with your friends, whereas you scroll through TikTok,
Right.
which makes it more hedonic, and maybe the Snapchat is more eudaimonic, though we didn't frame it in that way. Maybe that's how we should write this paper.
We did ask about specific emotions. So, like, how much does each platform make you feel specific
Mhm.
emotions? So we asked for hopeful, connected, joyful, stressed, depressed, and guilty. So three sort
Mhm.
of positive emotions and three sort of maybe less positive emotions,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And we do see Snapchat was very consistent in having a large connected component. So when you talk about loneliness in Snapchat use, that makes a lot of sense to me because that's what people are reporting, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They feel connected with Snapchat.
And was that higher than for the other media
Yeah,
platform?
if I look compared to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, for sure, Snapchat had a much bigger sort of connected component.
Okay.
Or TikTok too as well. Yeah, TikTok had a much bigger joyful and hopeful component.
Hmm.
And we see sort of stressed, depressed, and guilty showing up for Twitter and Instagram. Yeah.
Yeah, Twitter was at the bottom of our barrel too in terms of loneliest. But wait, were you saying TikTok was high on connectedness or low?
It was lower on connectedness. It
Okay,
was,
okay,
yeah,
that's what I
no.
would have
Snapchat was
expected.
definitely the most. Instagram was second. It looks like, and then
Okay.
sort of Twitter, TikTok-ish. They were kind of in the same.
One thing we tried to get at in our study, which maybe we're cutting this data because I just made this scale up, and so it's not validated, but the idea of the strength of the social bond, right? The social
Mhm.
capital you have, the strength of ties with the people with whom you're communicating. So I noticed in myself, and I don't know if this is true for you or your participants, that like you said, watching movies with my family, I was doing Zoom chats with family members who, these are stronger ties, but they're extended families. So they're not, the immediate super strong ties. But being able to connect with those people in that, I guess, medium tie range is different than connecting with the weak tie,
Mhm.
people in my Facebook network who I haven't seen in 20 years, or just people I'm following on Twitter, right? So I would imagine the stronger the tie, the more kind of stress management there is, helping me cope. Um,
probably in the
did you see
connection.
any? Yeah. And then that probably differs by medium too, right? Like on TikTok, it's a bunch of randos.
Well, I
So,
think we have to think about the motivations for using each platform too, right? So in our samples, they were really cognizant. They were really self-aware of the motivations, right? So they said,
mhm,
look, I go to Twitter to check out what's happening, like
mhm.
what's going on with the pandemic, what's going on with the election. I go there to check these things, right? It's like a really strong surveillance motive if you can think of it from, theoretical perspectives, right?
Mhm,
And whereas TikTok, people go on there to be entertained,
mhm, mhm.
like straight up. I just want to be entertained.
Yeah.
I want to see people dancing and doing goofy stuff. Like that's it.
Yeah. It's not
Whereas like
about,
sort of
yeah,
yeah, it's not about I think
friends.
yeah, it's not about friends. It's not. But whereas like Snapchat, you really have to reach out, and we didn't ask about Zoom so much, although because like most people were saying that they were using that for work,
Mhm.
not for sort of pleasure mode, and we were really looking for like leisure time pleasure
Yeah.
motives,
Yeah.
like what are you doing when you don't have to be on the clock, when you don't have to be on Zoom, what are you doing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we didn't see a whole lot of that going on.
Hello, listener. It's me, but I'm an avatar. You probably learn about avatars in this podcast, but you can actually try them out, not just in video games, but in spaces like Zoom. I'm using Zoom to record this right now. This avatar I created with Ready Player Me. Remember in episode a long time ago, I talked to Timo Toke, the CEO of Wolf 3D. That's the company that makes Ready Player Me. I took a screenshot of myself with my camera, a selfie, I should say, and I created an avatar automatically, customized it in their app. Then I posted it in Animes. That's the software I'm using right now. They are the sponsor of this message, and they are giving a 50% discount on subscriptions. You can try it for free, but if you want to subscribe, you enter SPARTIE Lab as the discount code. That's SPARTIE Lab. So you can use a Ready Player Me avatar, like I mentioned. You can also upload your own VRM or live 2D models, or you can make avatars right in Animes. For example, you could use the Doge avatar. And I don't know. I mean, it might have seemed like a strange thing at first, but Dogecoin is still making bucks. But you could use the Doge avatar or one of their very cool anthropomorphic animals, such as the Fluffo, the raccoon. Totally detailed. Look at this. It's so responsive. People use these types of avatars to stream or go to Zoom meetings or go to court cases and say, I am not a cat. There are also two-dimensional avatars like this raccoon, or more anthropomorphic avatars that aren't even animals, like this cute pandemic virus right here. Corey the COVID. Maybe this one won't win you too many friends. I really like Kathy. She's quite a catch. You could choose whichever avatar you like. And then you could even apply some of the concepts like the Proteus effect or other phenomena related to avatars in the workplace to your uses of these avatars based on what you've learned in this podcast. And once again, if you want to try it out, go to Steam, download Animes, try it for free, and then if you want a subscription, you can get 50% off for a limited time by entering SPARTIE Lab in the discount code. Check it out. Now, back to our conversation with Dr. Allison. I feel like Eden. Maybe there's a theoretical model in the works in the future, categorizing these media platforms and motivations and types of people you communicate with. And of course, this research is happening at a unique point in time, but maybe there are more generalizable kind of trends in these types of media platforms that will last beyond the pandemic. I don't know.
Well, that's sort of what we argued in our papers is like, hey, yeah, this was at a really specific time point. We were really looking at well-being and media use like at a really specific point in time where there was a lot going on that was really, unique to sort of March 2020, right? But I think that a lot of the sort of motives and outcomes that we saw generalized to other people. So for example, I have another paper with and it really is, it's a sort of a series at this point, with Matthias Hofer,
Hmm.
where we look at sort of the aging process and how people select different types of entertainment experiences over the course of the lifespan.
Hmm.
And we framed it in a lifespan development model, selection optimization compensation model, which is really a development. It's really a sort of a lifespan model about how people age and what activities they take part in as they sort of mature and go from like a young adult to an older adult, right?
Hmm.
And so with Matthias, we did things like we compared a sample of younger, 18 to 24-year-olds with older adults who were experiencing, significant, so 65 plus, but the majority of our sample was actually 80 plus. It was people who were experiencing significant health declines, many of whom were in, assisted living or nursing facilities.
Hmm.
And what we found was that there was a lot more sort of compensatory media use. So people, when they're older, they can't do the things that they used to do all the time. So they tend to use media more for sort of compensating, like for loneliness, right?
Hmm.
So my friends aren't around. My friends, I can't talk to them very often. So now I turn to television, and it's less gratifying, right? So it's not as positive an experience. It's compensating for what I can't get. Whereas when people are perhaps have access to a lot more potential options, we see that one, they tend to use media more for sort of really optimizing their well-being, and the fewer compensatory motives that they use for media selection, the sort of the better off they are. So I think if you think about sort of media selection as part of a whole lot of strategies that we can use to optimize our well-being, and you can see that we sort of can use media. One thing with entertainment that's neat is you can kind of like trade it out, right, to mix and match your motives. Like that's what makes it a super good coping tool is you can select what you want based on what you need at the time. So if you think about it more in sort of like a repertoire of potential coping strategies, it makes a lot of sense that people are being strategic about what they're turning to, and that eventually, the outcomes are going to be positive because we're all pretty sophisticated and expert media consumers at this point.
Absolutely. um I speaking of zombies, your mom's worried about you being a zombie. My wife and I watched a lot of zombie movies
Oh,
right at the beginning of
interesting.
the pandemic, and
Okay.
that was totally a coping mechanism. I don't, there must be some sort of theory here, maybe. Oh, what's the one about the mortality? um
Mortality salience. Yeah,
Marty
who I don't know if you've ever talked to what's his name? Clayson. He's got a recreational fear lab. So he studies why people turn to horror movies, and he just had a book come out called "A Very Anxious Person's Guide to Horror Movies." I believe it's. I'll have to send you the title. And
Great.
I got it because I'm a very anxious person, right? Or I'm a very nervous person, and I can't watch horror. So like for me, that coping strategy would not work. But a lot of people reported what you did, right? That they were turning to zombie movies, or like Contagion, like I said, #1 movie, and I was like, oh
Yeah,
my god, even thinking about it made me stressed out, right? So it's a very different uh, way of coping with stress. So some people like to
sure.
meet it head on, right? So like
Hmm.
so I think what people who are doing that, they're like, gosh, this pandemic is really stressing me out, but like I can cope with my fear of horror movies or zombies, so I'm gonna emotionally attack my fear in this realm because it's
Yeah,
safe and I
yeah.
know it's gonna be okay, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's that
Yeah,
horror element too. And then I think also, now that I ponder it a little more, there's a bit of uncertainty reduction
yeah.
because many zombie movies have this narrative of a pandemic, a worldwide
Hmm.
pandemic. So thinking about like, well, how do these things really play out? These Hollywood productions have thought a lot about what it would look like. And I found myself drawn to the stories that took a macro stance, not just like a few people surviving, a bunch of zombies trying to kill them, but what it's not Contagion. It's the other one that I think Brad Pitt is in it.
Oh,
And
World War Z.
yeah, World War Z takes a kind of high level, like this
Hmm.
is the cause, this is how we're trying to stop it, this is society falling apart. So in contrast to that, the COVID-19 wasn't that bad, right?
Yeah, and so it's interesting because we did have some people who were saying like, look, I sought out horror movies and I felt better, right? So that's kind of like this Clayson argument, the recreational fear. Like I can deal with
Yeah.
my fear in a safe environment and it makes me feel better,
Mhm.
right? And then you have like sort of my emotional coping perspective, which would say, like, if you're already stressed, like, if you're already really anxious, don't watch something that's going to make you more anxious, right? So
Yeah.
so for me, when I watch a horror movie, or when I watch even a suspense film, like, I think my husband got frustrated because I was literally only watching like reality competition shows, like baking shows and home improvement shows. Like, I was the
Ah,
lowest possible level of stress and arousal.
interesting. Interesting.
You
So,
know, I was
well,
like, I don't want to see it. I don't want to see it. I'm already dealing with it. I want to be
sure.
comforted.
So what do you think, what's the moderating factor that would predict whether someone goes toward that, like meet it head on and think about the stressful thing in this entertainment context, or escape it entirely and try to cope by not thinking about it? Like, is it there an individual difference? You said maybe anxiety level of the individual. Is that the main one, or are there others? What do you think?
Well, they're different coping strategies, right? So one's sort of like an approach oriented coping strategy, like a
Mhm.
approach oriented
Yeah,
emotional coping strategy, like, I'm going to meet it head on, I'm going to deal with
yeah.
this, right? Whereas the other is perhaps an
Avoidance.
avoidance.
Yeah, yeah,
Right? And
absolutely.
that's we see that, and I mean, a bunch of other, media scholars have studied coping styles and
Hmm.
media selection. Sylvia Knobloch,
Yeah.
Westerwick down at Ohio State,
Hmm.
Robin Nabi, both have looked at sort of what we turn to under what kind of coping strategy. And
Interesting.
I think that's what you're seeing. They're kind of a
Yeah,
division.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting. Okay, so let's bring it back to VR and avatars, because
Sure.
that's what I have to do with every podcast episode.
That's fine.
So,
We can do VR. We can do avatars.
so imagine a world, I don't know, 5 years from now, 8 years from now, where presumably lots of people have VR headsets, or they're wearing augmented reality glasses, and we're surrounded by highly immersive media as an option in our regular media diet. Maybe we don't see a lot of people turning, or we didn't see many turning to that type of media use now, because, or during the pandemic, because they're just not as widely available. But when they are available, what do you think would be different about media use habits? Or I guess, how would these same trends be manifested in coping with the pandemic, but in the metaverse, so to speak?
Well, so it's interesting you asked that. I actually had a paper with Grace on we the IEEE VR conference. It's a big conference for
Mhm.
like academic researchers and practitioners of VR. So the conference was held in Hubs last year in
Mozilla
March.
Hubs, the virtual environment.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so it's a 3D, immersive virtual environment. And there was also an option to log in on just like your computer screen, right? So you could either log in with your glasses, or you could log in with you. So we actually we have one paper out already on this topic, and then we have another one coming. But we interviewed the people who were at the conference about sort of the benefits of logging in via VR versus flat screen.
Hmm.
And found that people who were very comfortable with VR and had access to the technology really enjoyed it in the immersive sort of world. So the reason I'm saying that is because I could see that translating entertainment wise, right? So I mean, I have a headset at home because I study this kind of stuff, and my kids really enjoyed it. They did a bunch of simulation games, and we played a bunch of Beat Saber, just dancing games, just for fun. But one of the things that we saw in the conference data was that people got fatigued from being in sort of this immersive environment, and that they didn't like being disconnected from sort of their home environment.
Hmm.
So to a certain extent, some of this technology, even when it's connecting us virtually, it might be removing us from connection sort of face to face. So I think that's something that we have to consider as researchers, like, when is it optimizing versus when is it getting in the way of
Yeah.
the kind of emotional effects that we're looking for. That said, like, purely from an entertainment perspective, um, there's nothing like dancing in a 3D immersive environment with other people. Like, they're just, that's great. That's amazing. That's an experience that you can have from your house very safely. No pandemic, no germs around, right? That is very reminiscent of, dancing at a club with your friends, right?
But no one's going to step on your feet either.
That's true. And you might trip over a dog or something, or a kid.
Ah,
So I do think that we're going to see that, becoming more prominent. I mean, you can look and see the VR adoption and even AR. You know, if I think about augmented reality games like Pokemon Go, right? We saw Pokemon Go change certain settings during the pandemic to make it easier to play from home without having to leave your house and play. And I think that was really smart because a lot of people would put it down, picked it back up again, and we're playing it pretty obsessively. Myself and my family included. Personal N of 1 experience there. But I think that, you know, you have to, again, it's part of a strategy, right? It's part of like a holistic life strategy about how we manage our time and what we spend time doing. And when it meets people's needs in a positive way, I think you're going to see adoption and continued use. When it starts to provoke goal conflict and difficulty in meeting multiple goals, so like in the case of our conference, people wanted to meet their academic goals by joining this conference, but then they had to take care of their kids or log into the office, or they lived across the world, so they were logging in at midnight. And it, you know, so when you see that kind of like goal conflict happening, then people stopped using the media. And I think that, you know, not to be like everything's the same, but I mean, I think VR and AR have a place in that repertoire of like coping strategies and in that repertoire of entertainment or even work-based sort of things that we do. But it's always going to come down to sort of how functional is it for the individual.
Absolutely. So it's not going to replace the good old, you know, doom scrolling on whatever platform of choice, but there might be a place for it. Where would the best coping happen in VR? So what context or need for approach or avoidance? I guess avoidance, right? If you really want to shut yourself out from the pandemic, like literally, like you said, cutting your connection to face off would help.
I mean, I think that's where we see it right now, is people using it as distraction, right? Because it is immersive. It's a really good distraction, right? Because if you have the goggles on and you've got the headset on and you've got the headphones on, like you're not engaging with anything around you, right? You're withdrawing from everything. So I think that's kind of, you know, as a distraction tool, I think it's really effective. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, when you talk about comparing it to like doom scrolling, right? One of the reasons so many people get into these doom scrolling spirals is because you can do it with one hand, right? Mm-hmm. Like like a lot of people are doing multi-screening, multitasking, like they're watching TV and scrolling with the phone in the hand. So I think the ability to do those things together like contributes to the amount of time that we spend doing it. Whereas with VR, because you're sort of removing yourself from any environment except for that immersive environment, you're going to see people who will dedicate space and time to that activity.
And only that activity.
And only that activity, right? But that's what I'm saying, right? It can't be like, you can't be doing two things at the same time. Now, you know, I say that, and you can think about, you know, we a lot of times we will cast what people are seeing in the VR onto a TV screen or something, so it can be much more of a social activity. That's something we do in our family, you know, so we can all watch and see what somebody's doing.
You know, and the other side of it that I think of is the quasi augmented experience. So you're in the headset and you've got multiple virtual monitors, but you can actually use your real keyboard because you can see it. It's not pass through, it's digital, but then there could be pass through, or I could doom scroll with a, you know, I could have a little window in the corner as part of the UI, the operating system UI, where I can still look at my mobile phone screen, but I'm in VR playing the game, but at the same time as running the other softwares. We haven't gotten into that kind of parallel processing or multitasking in VR much, as far as I've seen, but I can imagine a software solution to making it harder for us to take the headsets off.
Yeah, I could too, especially when you talk about things like glasses. And I think the lower the barrier is to being in that environment, and the more able you are to be sort of have that split screen sort of idea. I mean, I think one of the reasons people are so concerned about like multitasking and screen time is because, like I said, you can do it while doing other things, right? Before that, we were worried about having the TV on while people ate dinner. You know what I mean? So there's always something we're concerned about. But, you know, I think if you have like the AR goggles or glasses on, or you have the VR glass, so you have something in your periphery that you're attending to at the same time that you're attending to the main task, or switching between, I think I think it's both a hardware and a software issue, right? Is kind of what I'm trying to say. Like, I
Yeah.
think part of the issue is that hardware is separating you from what's going on around you. Part of the issue is like you said, software based, is that we haven't seen a lot of sort of like the goal of a lot of VR technology is to immerse you, right? Is to make you feel present in sort of a surrounded environment. It's not to let you access Twitter while you're washing the dishes, right? Like, that is just different purposes.
Sure. But if I'm washing the dishes and it looks like I'm slaying alien germ monsters, and I can still scroll on my Twitter.
I think if we see that, I think that would be great. I would love an app like that, right? Like, I might do the dishes more.
Yeah.
You make, I mean, but that's the whole, when we talk about media for coping, we're really talking about using technology to sort of, address these emotional needs we have, right? So it's not so much that like one technology is better than another or more adaptive, or one content is better than another or more. It's sort of how people are selecting to use it and work it into their own needs and motivations, right?
Yeah. Very interesting. So right now we say don't text and drive. In the future, it'll be don't play VR games and drive.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of games have things like, especially games on the phone, they have things like, are you driving? Like, don't play this while you're driving, you know?
Yeah.
Which, I support, for the record, but
But you can listen to podcasts while you drive, and maybe someone's listening right now to this podcast and driving, and I hope you're doing so safely.
Yeah.
Allison, thank you so much. This was great. I think, do you have any last bits of insight for people who we've got a range of listeners? Some of them are interested more in the psychology of game studies and media effects. Others more interested in the metaverse and VR. So anywhere that they should go look for more information, or?
We do have, a media psychology program at Michigan State. So for people that are interested, we have a really good research network here. Robby's part of it. I'm part of it. We have a lot of people here who are interested in these questions and having a lot of fun exploring it. So I would check out the Media Psychology Research Group. My research lab is the TARMAC lab, the Theoretical and Applied Research in Media and Cognition lab here at Michigan State. Yes, it's kind of a mouthful. It's almost as big of a mouthful as the SPARTIE-Cast, so not quite. But
we'll put a link to your lab in the notes too. And
sounds good.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Allison.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to this episode of SPARTIE-Cast. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and hit like, and tell someone. Tell Shibu Inu not to doge this episode. So sorry. Thanks to our production team, Taylor Halterman, Kyle Takte, and Mia Berghardt. And thank you for listening to SPARTIE-Cast. Hope you come back next time.
Thank you for tuning into SPARTIE-Cast. Goodbye, world.